Okay, great. All right, we'll go ahead and get started.
Yay! Half an hour.
So it's 10:30, so we'll just go a little bit longer today. I do apologize. I was just praying, Lord, we just thank you for your grace today. We thank you for your mercy. Thank you for getting our sound back up. And we just pray, as the sun's outside, that you would be inside our hearts, Lord. Just touch us, we pray, in Jesus' name. All I was held dear, build my life upon all this review and rose before. All I was thy gain, I have found spent and this now. Knowing you, Jesus, knowing you, there is no greater thing. You're my all, you're the best. You're my joy, my righteousness, and I love you. Don't try to play all the notes if you can. Now my heart's desire is to know you more, to be in you and known as yours, to possess what I do, You're my all, you're the best. You're my joy, my righteousness. You're my all, you're the best. You're my joy, my righteousness. You're my all, you're the best. You're my joy, my righteousness, and I love you. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. Worthy is the King who reigned. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. The Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy, worthy. This is amazing grace. This is Lord, we thank you as we celebrated your resurrection last week, as we do every day of the year, Lord. We celebrate it today, and we thank you so much that you are risen. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, let's get transitioned over here.
Walk away from him. He threw rocks at me the entire time. I have them right in the trash.
Okay, I just want to thank you for being here with us today, and we're just so grateful that you're here, and bless you, and let's just pray one more time as we get into the Word. It is important you turn open to John 21. We're just going to continue on with the resurrection, after the resurrection, and what happened. So let's pray. Father, thank you so much for this day. We worship you and praise you and give you the glory and the honor. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. The title of my message this morning is Dispelling Disappointment. Dispelling Disappointment. And this is my argument. Jesus will dispel disappointment in our lives by showing himself God over our normal. Jesus will dispel disappointment by showing himself God over our normal. In other words, Jesus comes into our everyday lives and brings us to the end of ourselves so that we can see the beginning of what he is capable of. We see ourselves and our inabilities, our weaknesses. I mean, take this virus. We see our humanness. And God is showing us that he is God. And we can easily get disappointed and discouraged and wonder about our ability and knowledge and advances and wonder, what happened? Why are we in this place? What's going on? And we can start to think, is this the end of me? And God can say, it's the end of you, but the beginning of me. And that's the best place to be in all of life, is to realize that we are men, that we are human, and that God is God. Eternal, beyond time, has existed forever. Amazing. The application today should be that in each case of disappointment, discouragement, or disillusionment, we see God better, listen to him closer, and follow him more fully. So listen to that again. That'll be the application, that we see God better, we listen to him closer, and follow him more fully. This is the great goal of our great God. In the midst of our supposed accomplishments and accolades, we see that all the time it is God. And so he removes things and sometimes rearranges things so that we have nowhere else to turn, so that we can see him clearly, his power and glory, and then, relying upon him, change as people and stick close to him, closer than ever before. This is always when big things happen in the Bible. Maybe you feel or have felt like the U.S. President Abraham Lincoln in 1858, who, after losing his Senate seat to Stephen Douglas and asked by a sympathetic friend how he felt, replied, "I feel like a boy who stubbed his toe. I'm too big to cry and too badly hurt to laugh." Maybe you feel that way. Too big to cry, too badly hurt to laugh. I can't depend upon God. I can't really look to him right now. I'm going to handle this myself. I'm going to tie myself up by my own bootstraps, and I'm going to get through this. Well, interesting. There's another illustration, true story of Oswald Smith, who it was his desire to go to the mission field. And he so longed to go tell people about Christ. It was his great passion. Well, that was his dream, but that was dashed by a board of people who said, "You weren't called to become a missionary." He said, "There's an open door and I can't go." Apparently he, quote unquote, failed the test. Well, we'll come back to that at the end this morning, but just wanted you to know, whenever you think you're failing, and when you are failing, that's when you're winning. That's when it's ripe for God to do a great and mighty work in each of our lives. Now, the scene that Jesus has appeared to the disciples, the scene before us, is that Jesus has appeared to the disciples 2 times before this. So before John 21, Jesus has appeared to the disciples 2 times already, and this is the 3rd time in this section. They're out fishing, and Peter has basically said, Lord, I'm just going to go back and fish. You can read this in the first 4 verses of the chapter. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. And in this way, he showed himself. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Canaan in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, the 2 sons of his 2 others of his disciples were together. We don't know who those were. And Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. Again, Jesus has appeared. He's risen from the dead. But here's Peter saying, I'm going to go fishing. And they went out and immediately got into the boat. And that night, they caught nada, nothing. But when the morning had now come, Jesus stood on the shore. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Now let me say, at this time, there is much speculation about Peter here, and there are really 3 plausible options, possibly even more. Some say he was in complete disobedience and uncommitted to the Lord. Others, he was just practical, and in the sense that he needed funds and money to live, and so had to go back to work. And this is not necessarily a bad or disobedient decision. He was just being practical. It could also be that Peter, not necessarily being disobedient or practical, but more so disappointed. Maybe he was just struggling with the reality of the resurrection in terms of his previous failure. It just took Peter some time to make the connection and jump from his old responsibilities and his new call. In fact, it was here where Peter receives his call to the ministry at the end of this chapter. We looked a little bit at that last week because God overcomes failure. But I'm just kind of going to focus on this time right now as Peter goes back to fishing. Another real possibility is that Peter didn't want to have to face Jesus. So he goes back to fishing. You see, at this point, Jesus had no one-on-one. Peter had no one-on-one with Jesus yet. There had been no conversation. There was an elephant in the room. You know that expression. There's something heavy on Peter's heart. There's something he needed to talk to Jesus, but he didn't want to face it. How many times do you run away from things that you need to deal with, either with others or with the Lord? So there was that elephant in the room. And it was Peter's denial of Jesus. I mean, here's Peter, I'll never deny you. And then we have the classic story of Peter's denial right afterwards. You know, that's reason for disappointment. Why are you disappointed? Is it because you have something hidden? Something that hasn't been brought from the darkness to the light? Something you haven't put before him and not really given over to him? May I just say that confession is so healing. But, you know, it's our natural human tendency to want to push away and not deal with, not admit to our failures. And that may be where Peter was. This may be the one thing that we need to be able to see the glory of God and to walk in his power once again. A really good sit-down chat with Jesus. Peter eventually has this again at the end of the chapter. He said, Lord, you know I love you. I would personally argue against Peter having anything to do with this instance. Why do we always try and figure out what man is trying to do? What motivates the man? And blame him for the trouble or the problems or the subsequent disappointments. Again, you'll read commentaries and they'll try to figure out why did Peter go back to fishing. And you know, the bottom line is disappointment comes when we forget to keep our eyes on Jesus. Encouragement and walking on water comes when we have our eyes on Jesus and realize that he is in control of our lives on a very practical level. When we incorporate him into our decisions and trust him, we can lean on him and he will direct our paths and guide our steps. In Proverbs 3:5-7, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. That's one we don't often quote. We quote verses 5 and 6, but we don't talk about do not be wise in your own eyes. And Peter, in this instance, may have just been avoiding the conversation, kind of wise in his own eyes, just trying to figure out how to do this. He goes out, and I might remind you, they didn't catch anything. That being the case, we see the end result, and in each case, no matter what Peter's motive and heart, Jesus is the answer to disappointment, because no matter what's going on in Peter's heart and mind, when he gets out onto the water, he is disappointed because there's nothing to catch. Doesn't matter his motives. Disappointment came when there was nothing to catch. And I can argue that the fact is that there were no fish to catch. It's possible that Jesus was up to something. We think about the miracle when Jesus is going to say, throw the net on the other side, and the net was full of fish. But what about the fact that there's no fish? I mean, can you imagine? Here it is, the God of the universe, whispering to all the fish, saying, hey, can you guys just wait over here on the other side of the boat? And, I'm going to ask them to throw the net on the other side. But right now, I just want them to know that I'm in control. Okay, guys, we're out in the water. Here's what I want you to do. He whispers in the ears of the fish. By the way, I have a very personal connection with fishing. My grandfather was a great fisherman. He actually won a fishing boat, and he was a bass fisher. Bass fishing is one of the most complicated types of fishing because you have to have a worm on the end of your hook, and you have to pull it and taunt the fish. And then once the hook gets in the mouth, you actually have to pull it properly to hook the mouth. And if you don't, that fish will spit it right out. It's called big mouth bass. And he was a great bass fisher. He fished all over North America and in Canada. And, my grandfather, he could catch a fish with his eyes closed. He was an amazing fisherman. I presume that these guys were amazing fishermen. And I could argue that the fact that they caught no fish was something that God had orchestrated. So how does God work through disappointment? I don't know if you've ever been disappointed, but maybe now you're disappointed, possibly. Maybe you had dreams and plans and thought that everything was going to work out a certain way, but then everything hits powerfully and you're sitting there wondering, what do I do now? Hopefully as a Christian, you're turning to God and reading the Bible and taking time to really unite your heart with His. Do you think that maybe this is what God has been saying all the while through this current disruption we're in? First of all, note, it brings them to the end of themselves. God did this a lot. He brings people to the end of themselves. And that's so they'll take their eyes off themselves so that they can see God. He says in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 to 10, Paul the apostle, the great apostle now, mind you, he's praying. And he's praying that God would remove a thorn in his flesh. We don't know exactly what that is. Might have been his eyesight, but we don't exactly know. Whatever it is, this is what we read in these verses. 2 Corinthians 12, 7 to 10. And least I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations. A thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me. Lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, he says, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasures in my infirmities and reproaches and needs and persecutions and distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And why did God allow that thorn in the flesh? So that Paul could rely upon the grace of God. God is speaking to Paul, this great apostle, and he says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Consider the call in the Old Testament of many men of God that God called in weakness. Consider Gideon for a moment. Now Gideon, he knew he was weak. When the angel came to Gideon to call him into battle against the Midianites and to become a judge in the book of Judges, Gideon's like, man, not me. What are you talking about? You must be talking about somebody else. as my friend always says, who now lives in Texas, he's actually from Bilton, he used to say, I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed. And Gideon was basically saying that. I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed. And God called Gideon. Now, why did God call Gideon? Because God doesn't want man to have any glory for anything that happens, basically. And then it says in verse 2 of chapter 7 in Judges, I'll just read this. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into your hands, lest Israel claim glory for itself against me. Did you hear that? Lest Israel claim glory for itself against me. Whenever we claim glory for what we've done, it's actually working against God. This is why salvation is only by the work of Christ. It has to be that way, because anything else is a debt that we owe and a glory that we take unto ourselves. But salvation can't be earned. It's by grace through faith that we've been saved, not by works, lest anyone should what? Boast. Ephesians chapter 2. So God says, I'm going to call Paul, and I'm going to give him a thorn in the flesh so that he'll learn that my grace is sufficient for him. I'm going to call Gideon into ministry because I realize that Gideon won't take the glory on himself. God actually took Gideon's little army, which was already little, and he made it smaller. So with 300 men, Gideon went against the Midianites, who had over 100,000, I think. So, amazing. Now, God makes us weak. Notice what it says as we read on in verses 5 to 11 in John 21. So back in John 21, we read, Then Jesus said to them, Children, have you any food? And they answered him, No. And he said to them, Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. So again, now Jesus is speaking to the fish, the God of the universe, speaking fish language, saying, Okay, guys, you can jump in the net now. Ready? Go! Everybody jumps in the net. And the disciples whom Jesus loved said to Peter, It's the Lord. Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and plunged into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far off from land, but about 200 cubits, dragging the net with fish. Then as soon as they had come to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on it, and bread. Jesus said to them, Bring some of the fish which you have just caught. Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to land, full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not broken. Mark that. Although there was so many, there was large fish, the net was not broken. I think that's a powerful reminder to us, is that when God is doing something, the net's not going to break. Your life is not going to fall apart when your life is connected to Christ. His grace is sufficient for us, because in our weakness, His strength is made perfect. We don't have to worry about the net breaking. I love that. Look at all the miracles in here. In spite of Peter, whatever his motivation was to go back fishing, whether it was right or wrong, or there was some questionable things and he didn't want to face Jesus, God told the fish, don't let them catch anything. They're fishing for you. Then he tells the fish to go in the net, he tells the disciples to throw it on the other side. And then they bring in such a load of fish, that net presumably should have been broken. But the net didn't break. So God in control the whole time. And when God puts a family together, when God puts an individual together, when God puts a church together, when God puts a world together, it's not going to break. Only God can do that. I can't put my life together, my marriage together, my kids together, all of life. I am dependent upon the Lord. Without Him, I can do nothing. Jesus said that in John 15. Without me, you can do nothing. Paul, in Philippians 4, said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can't do anything apart from Christ, but I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. So one thing we can say is that fish take center stage in the Gospels. I mean, that's a big thing. fish are all throughout the Gospels. We see at one point people trying to trick Jesus about giving taxes to Caesar. He tells Peter to go get a fish, pulls out of the mouth of the fish a coin. Jesus asks whose image is on this, and then he says, give to Caesar what's Caesar's, give to God what is God's. Jesus, with the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus is there, and the disciples are saying, hey, the 5,000, they're hungry. And Jesus says, what do we have? And there's a little boy with a little bit of fish. Jesus takes that, prays to the Father, and then we have the multiplication of the food for the thousands. So Jesus used the little boy's lunch to feed a lot of people on more than one occasion. And it was, again, just a few fish and a little boy. God can do anything with little. We're just reminded over and over again. So fish, a big part of the Gospels. Of course, Jesus spent a lot of time in the Sea of Galilee, and he called, most of the disciples he called were fishermen. So what does this mean? He will take whatever's in our lives and use it to bring us to him. Disappointment, discouragement, failure, doesn't matter. Now, earlier I spoke of disappointment, and I was speaking about Oswald Smith. And he was not able to go to the mission field, I said. And he was trying to figure out what to do, so he prayed. And you know what? He got another idea in his heart. It's a beautiful story. God gave him an idea. He said, if I can't go to be a missionary, I'm going to build a church that'll send out missionaries. And he did. Oswald Smith later pastored the People's Church in Toronto, Canada, and that church sent out more missionaries than any other church at the time. Oswald Smith brought God into the situation. Although his heart was crushed, his plans were dashed, his dreams and hopes gone, God transformed his detour into a main thoroughfare of service to reach the whole world. As I was reading about this section, I came across a section of a passage commentary from Ray Stedman, who's on the internet, very easy to find. Ray Stedman said this: people who think they've done it all for themselves are common today. Every now and then I meet someone who claims to be a self-made man. I've discovered, however, that most self-made men worship their creator. Yet nothing is more revealing of human ignorance than the claim to be a self-made man. That's to take for granted all that's been provided for them all throughout their lives without giving a thought for who provided it. Yet, were it not for God's providing hand, we would have neither the opportunities nor the resources to begin with. The writer continues, success, yes, even spiritual success, can be a snare and a ruin, while failure can be an unspeakable benefit. Failure is often the only test by which the real worth and quality of a man or woman can be tried. It is in failure that a man begins to think, to wonder whence his failure comes, to look around and seek for the reasons, to put into his work double watchfulness and double energy, and to look upwards to him who can turn failure into a glorious achievement. And that's exactly what we're looking at. In 1 Corinthians 10, 12 to 13, there's another section of verses. It says, therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will also make a way of escape that you may be able to bear it. Listen to that again, because I think this is really what Stedman is talking about and what I'm seeing in this chapter right now with Peter. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as common to a man, common to man. But God is faithful. Listen, God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. In summary, this is what I see. Jesus uses whatever he can to bring us to the end of us so we can see the beginning of him, so that we can see him better. What do you have that maybe God has stripped away? He has brought you really to the end of yourself so that you can finally once and for all see him. That's the question. has he brought us to the end of ourselves that we can finally see him. Secondly, listen to him closer. Listen to him closer. I mean, what happens when we take things away? We can either turn to Amazon Prime or Disney Plus or some other form of entertainment. Those things are all good and have their place. But it's really dangerous when we turn to those things for our disappointment, for the fulfillment of our disappointment, to take care of our need, and not even facing our disappointment. Instead of what all the time God is doing, what God is doing is trying to take our eyes off of what we hope in and turn us to himself as the final and ultimate source of strength and hope, you see. By the way, Jesus never disappoints. Jesus never fails. Isn't that true? Thirdly, he does all of these things so that we can follow him more fully. I've heard this many times said by many of my pastor friends and church members and others. Right now I'm busier than I ever have been, and I'm just seeking the Lord. It's interesting because people are saying, you know what, I am seeking the Lord more than ever before. I have more time to really connect with Jesus. And I think that's so true, that we can follow him more fully now, more than ever before. So take some time and pray about this. Global pandemic aside, he's trying to reach you and I. Oh, that we would listen to him, his word, and his wisdom. He's trying to reach people and save them. Oh, that people would listen to him and be saved. You can make anything out of this time you want. I have some friends in Turlock, California, small town, and they love the Lord. They've been friends of ours for years. And, they're a great example of going through trials and temptations and frustrations and keeping their eyes on the Lord. Recently, we got a picture of the family in their attire as they were celebrating something we call in America the proms. The prom night is for seniors who are graduating from high school. And unfortunately, one of their daughters wasn't able to be a part of that because everybody's self-isolating. So mom and dad figured, hey, I'm going to make the best of this situation. They all got dressed up. They had a family dinner. They took pictures. They had a great time enjoying each other and giving their daughter this great time. Dad was dancing with her, and they were all dancing together, the music, and it was really neat. Just making a good time out of a difficult time. But you know how they can do that? And I think this is really important. When we become Christians and we're following God in times of disappointment, it doesn't mean we can't have fun. I think Christians are the only ones that have a reason for joy, a reason for being joyful and happy. Christians are the ones, really we are, that have a reason to dance and celebrate. And so, I just thought that was so cool. Consider the disappointment of Job for just a moment. And Job's a long book, and there's a lot to say about Job, but he lost everything. Talk about disappointment. Talk about the end of your rope. Talk about feeling alone and isolated. But God speaks to Job in Job chapter 41. And in trying to encourage Job, to remind Job that I am God of the universe, God speaks these words, and it just calms Job down. And this is what he says. Can you draw out the Leviathan with a hook? Or snare his tongue with a line, which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many supplications to you? Will he speak softly to you? Will he make a covenant with you? Will you take him as a servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird? Or will you leash him for your maidens? Will your companions make a banquet for him? Will they apportion him among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hand on him. Remember the battle. Never do it again. Indeed, any hope of overcoming him is false. Someone shall be overwhelmed at the sight of him. No one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me? Who has preceded me that I should pay him? Everything under heaven is mine. I will not conceal his limbs? His mighty power, his graceful proportions. Who can remove his outer coat? Who can approach him with a double bridle? Who can open the doors of his face with his terrible teeth all around? His rows of scale in his pride, shut up tightly as with a seal. One is so near another that no air can come in between. They're joined one to another. They stick together and cannot be parted. His sneezings flash forth a light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. By the way, does that sound like a dragon to you? Sounds like a dragon to me. Very interesting. Out of his mouth go burning lights. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke goes out of his nostrils as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. Strength dwells in his neck, and sorrow dances before him. The folds of his flesh are joined together. They are firm on him and cannot be moved. His heart is as hard as stone, even as hard as the lower millstone. When he rises himself up, the mighty are afraid because his crashings, they are beside themselves. And he goes on. He's talking about this Leviathan, this great creature. And God is basically telling Job, I have everything in control. He goes on and on about how he feeds the lions and the birds. And God is, again, in complete control. In James chapter 5, verse 11, we read, Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and see the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. I want you to know you're not alone in the fire. There's a new song by Hillsong, and it's a very applicable song in light of where we're at. And in that, they say, nothing stands between us. No problem, no distress, no fire, no virus. Nothing stands between us. And the power of Jesus to life is up and there for us. Jesus is there for us. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much again for your goodness and your mercy and your grace. We just worship you and praise you, and we're so thankful to you. And you're just good, Lord. Again, we thank you. We're going to attempt this song. It's such a great song, and I just hope it blesses you guys. Another in the fire, standing next to me. There was another in the waters, holding back the seas. Should I ever need how I've been set free? There is a cross that bears the burden, where another died for me. There is another. There's a place Sorry, guys. Let's try that again. There is no other name but the name that is Jesus. He who was and still is and will be through it all. So believe in the name and speak the name. All the things that you see and I will never be alone. I will never be alone. There's another standing next to me. There's another in the water, holding back the sea. Should I ever need reminding that you've been to me? I count the joy from every battle. Know it's where you'll be. There is another in the fire, standing next to me. Another in the water, holding back the sea. Should I ever need reminding how you've been to me? Count the joy from every battle. Know where you'll be. I can see the light in the darkness, darkness, darkness. I can hear the roar in the heavens as the space between us the ground, shaking beneath us as the prison walls cave in. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. I could see the light. There'll be another in the fire, standing next to me. Oh, Lord, stand next to us. Be with us and strengthen us, we pray in Jesus' precious name. Amen.
Amen.
God bless you guys.
How ridiculous. Why did that happen?
You're so funny.